Family loyalty usually has a price tag. For Abigail Mercer, it amounted to a rotting, termite-infested cabin in the middle of nowhere, while her half-siblings happily pocketed $40 million. But what those greedy heirs didn't know was that their father's true fortune was never sitting in the bank. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Abernathy, Cole and Thatcher, one of Boston's most elite law firms. Inside the mahogany-paneled conference room, the air was thick with the smell of expensive espresso damp wool and barely concealed greed. Abigail Mercer sat at the far end of the long oak table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore a simple charcoal grey coat she had bought off the rack 3 years ago. Across from her sat her half-siblings, Felix Dempsey and Carolyn Dempsey Roth. They looked as though they had stepped out of a luxury magazine's editorial on high society morning. Felix wore a tailored Italian suit that cost more than Abigail's car, while Carolyn was draped in a black cashmere dress, subtly checking her diamond-encrusted Rolex every few minutes. At the head of the table sat William Thatcher, a stern, white-haired attorney who had managed the legal affairs of their late father, Harrison Dempsey, for over 4 decades. Harrison had been a titan of the Northeast shipping and logistics industry, a ruthless businessman, a difficult father, and in his final years, a frail old man who had relied entirely on Abigail for his care. "If we could proceed, William," Felix said, his voice dripping with aristocratic impatience. "I have a board meeting at Dempsey Logistics at 2 o'clock, and the shareholders are already nervous about the transition. We need to wrap this up." Caroline sighed, adjusting her silk scarf. "Yes, please. This entire week has been utterly exhausting. The caterers for the memorial were simply dreadful." Abigail bit the inside of her cheek to keep from speaking. For 3 years, while Felix was expanding his tech portfolio in Silicon Valley, and Caroline was renovating her villa in Tuscany, Abigail had been the one changing Harrison's oxygen tanks, managing his relentless pain medication schedules, and listening to his feverish late-night regrets. She had put her nursing career on hold, moving into the stifling guest room of his estate, simply because he was her father, despite the fact that he had largely ignored her existence for the first 20 years of her life. William Thatcher cleared his throat, peering over his reading glasses. "Very well. I will skip the standard preamble. We are here to execute the final will and testament of Harrison Arthur Dempsey." He broke the heavy wax seal on the manila folder. For the next 20 minutes, William read through the staggering inventory of Harrison's empire. The distribution was brutally lopsided, though not entirely surprising to Abigail. To Felix, Harrison left his controlling shares in Dempsey Logistics, a portfolio of commercial real estate in downtown Manhattan, and the family's primary estate in Connecticut. The estimated value hovered around $25 million. To Caroline, he left the liquid assets in various Chase Bank and Fidelity investment accounts, the Hampton Summer House, and a collection of rare art. Her share easily amounted to $15 million. Felix and Caroline exchanged a brief, triumphant glance. The legacy was theirs. The power, the prestige, the capital, all safely secured. "And finally," William continued, his voice dropping slightly as his eyes flicked toward Abigail, "to my youngest daughter, Abigail Mercer." Abigail sat up a little straighter. She didn't want millions. She just wanted enough to pay off the medical debts she had accrued taking care of him, and perhaps enough to finally buy a small house of her own. She had sacrificed her savings to ensure he had round-the-clock comfort when his insurance balked at private home care costs. To Abigail. William read the paper, rustling in the quiet room. "I leave the property known as the Whispering Pines Tract, located in the Blackwood Mountains of Pennsylvania, including the cabin and the 10 acres of land upon which it sits. I also leave her my silver pocket watch, and my profound apologies." Silence stretched across the room, broken only by the sound of the rain. Caroline let out a short, ungraceful snort. A cabin, that old hunting shack. Good Lord, I thought he sold that dump in the 90s. It hasn't been maintained in 40 years. Felix leaned forward, a condescending smile playing on his lips. Well, Abigail, I suppose it's a fitting getaway. You always did prefer the quiet life. If you need help with the property taxes, which can't be more than a few $100 out there in the sticks, let my secretary know. I'll write you a check. Consider it back pay for playing nurse. The insult hit Abigail like a physical blow. Playing nurse. She felt a hot flush of humiliation creep up her neck. Her father, the man whose hand she had held as he took his final rattling breath, had left her a decaying wooden shack in the middle of nowhere while handing an empire to the children who couldn't even be bothered to attend his deathbed. "Is that all, Mr. Thatcher?" Abigail asked, her voice remarkably steady, despite the storm raging inside her. William looked at her with genuine pity. He slid a small, tarnished silver pocket watch across the polished table, followed by a thick, yellowed envelope containing the deed. "That is all, Miss Mercer. The property is legally transferred to your name, free and clear of any liens." Abigail stood up. She didn't look at Felix or Caroline. She didn't want to see their smug satisfaction. She took the watch, its metal cold against her palm, picked up the deed, and walked out of the conference room. As the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind her, she heard Caroline laugh. Honestly, Felix, what did she expect? She was the product of a brief indiscretion. She should be grateful she got a piece of land at all. Abigail walked out into the Boston rain, her hands shaking. It wasn't about the money. It was about the utter lack of respect. She felt entirely broken, but as she sat in her 10-year-old sedan, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white, a stubborn, burning resolve ignited in her chest. She wasn't going to let them see her break. She would go to Pennsylvania. She would fix up that damn cabin, sell it, and wash her hands of the Dempsey family forever. The drive to the Blackwood Mountains took 9 grueling hours. The final 40 miles were completely off the interstate, navigating deeply rutted logging roads that threatened to tear the suspension right out of Abigail's worn-out sedan. The GPS on her phone had lost signal 2 hours ago, leaving her to rely on the vague, hand-drawn map William Thatcher's assistant had provided. When she finally pulled up to the Whispering Pines property, the reality of her inheritance set in, and it was far worse than Caroline had described. The cabin sat in a shadowed clearing surrounded by towering, dense pines. It was a structural nightmare. The roof sagged heavily in the middle, looking as though a strong gust of wind would cave it in entirely. The wooden siding was blackened with rot and choked by aggressive ivy. The front porch steps had completely collapsed into a pile of splintered lumber, and the windows were caked in decades of grime. Profound apologies indeed, Abigail muttered to herself, turning off the engine. The silence of the forest was absolute, almost deafening. She grabbed her flashlight, a crowbar she had bought at a hardware store along the way, and a can of bear mace. Carefully navigating the broken porch, she forced her shoulder against the swollen front door. It shrieked in protest, the rusted hinges giving way as she stumbled into the gloom of the interior. The smell hit her instantly, a heavy, suffocating stench of mildew, damp earth, and animal droppings. The cabin was essentially one large room. A rusted cast-iron wood stove sat in the corner, its pipe disconnected. The furniture consisted of a rotting sofa, a heavy oak dining table covered in dust, and a collapsed bed frame. Spiderwebs hung in thick grey curtains from the rafters. Abigail felt a lump form in her throat. She had given up 3 years of her life, her savings, her social life, and her peace of mind for this. It was a monument to her father's disregard. She spent the first 2 hours just clearing out the debris, using a rusted snow shovel she found on the back porch to push decades of accumulated dirt and animal nests out the front door. She was angry, a deep, visceral anger that fueled her exhaustion. She wanted to burn the place to the ground to strike a match and watch Harrison Dempsey's final insult go up in smoke. As the afternoon sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long, eerie shadows across the wooden floorboards, Abigail sat down on the heavy oak table to catch her breath. The silence of the cabin was oppressive. She pulled her father's silver pocket watch from her coat pocket. It was a heavy antique piece, intricately engraved with vines. It didn't tick. The hands were permanently frozen at 10:24. She rubbed her thumb over the cold metal, wondering why he had bothered to leave it to her. It was broken just like everything else. Frustrated, she tossed the watch onto the table. It slid off the edge and hit the floor with a heavy thud. But the sound it made wasn't a dull thwack against solid wood. It was a sharp, resonating clank, a metallic echo that vibrated beneath the floorboards. Abigail froze. She stared at the floor. The cabin was built on a raised foundation of stone pillars. There shouldn't be anything metallic underneath the floorboards, let alone anything that produced a hollow echo. She slid off the table and knelt on the dirty floor. She tapped her knuckles against the wood. Thud. Thud. She moved a foot to the left near the center of the room, where a large, incredibly heavy and filthy braided rug lay firmly glued to the floor by years of moisture and dirt. She knocked again. Clank. Her heart began to race. Grabbing the crowbar, Abigail hooked the curved end under the edge of the stiff, heavy rug and pulled with all her strength. The ancient fabric tore, releasing a cloud of dust that made her cough violently. She dragged the rug aside, revealing the floorboards underneath. Unlike the rest of the cabin, the planks here were perfectly even. In fact, they weren't individual planks at all. It was a single solid sheet of heavy timber, cleverly disguised to look like the rest of the floor. And at the edge of the square was a recessed iron pull ring sitting flush with the wood. Abigail wiped the sweat from her forehead, her breathing shallow. She slipped the crowbar through the iron ring and pulled upwards. The wood groaned, protesting against the movement, but slowly the heavy trap-door swung open on thick, hidden hinges. Beneath the door wasn't the dark, dirt-packed crawl space she expected. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a staircase made of solid, poured concrete leading straight down. The air that wafted up was remarkably dry and smelled faintly of ozone and machine oil, a stark contrast to the rotting cabin above. Gripping the crowbar tightly, Abigail descended the stairs. There were exactly 20 steps. When her boots hit the bottom floor, the flashlight revealed a space that made absolutely no sense. She was standing in a reinforced concrete bunker. The walls were thick, military-grade cement. The temperature was perfectly regulated, crisp and cool. In the center of the room, a single pull-string overhead light hung from the ceiling. She reached up her hand, trembling, and pulled the cord. Fluorescent bulbs flickered to life, with a low hum, bathing the underground room in stark white light. Abigail gasped, dropping her flashlight. Lining the walls were dozens of heavy fireproof steel lockboxes stacked neatly on industrial metal shelving. Against the far wall sat a massive vintage Mosler bank, safe, its thick steel dial gleaming under the lights. But what drew Abigail's immediate attention was a simple metal desk in the center of the room. On the desk sat a neat stack of bound ledgers, a small leather pouch and a sealed envelope with her name, Abigail, written in her father's sharp, distinctive handwriting. She walked toward the desk on shaking legs. She picked up the envelope and broke the seal. The letter inside was dated just 6 months prior, during a period when Harrison's mind had been unusually clear. My dearest Abigail, if you are reading this, it means you had the sheer stubbornness to visit this miserable property and the intelligence to look beneath the surface. It means William Thatcher did his job, and it means Felix and Caroline took the bait. For years I have watched your siblings turn into vultures. They care nothing for the legacy of my work, only the status it affords them. I knew that the moment I died, They would carve up the visible company and the real estate, like a Thanksgiving turkey, leaving you with nothing. They think they have won. They think they have inherited my empire. They are wrong. The assets I left them are heavily leveraged, tied up in corporate debt and impending antitrust lawsuits I have carefully kept buried for years. By next quarter, Dempsey Logistics will be a financial sinkhole. This room contains the true Dempsey fortune. Over the last 20 years, I have quietly liquidated my personal equity, untraceable private investments, and offshore accounts. I converted them into assets no government or greedy sibling can touch. Abigail's hands shook violently as she set the letter down and reached for the small leather pouch on the desk. She untied the thick cord and tipped the contents onto the metal surface. A heavy, flawless diamond, the size of a quail's egg, tumbled out, catching the fluorescent light and throwing fractured rainbows across the concrete walls. The safe behind you, the letter continued, contains bearer bonds, gold bullion, and deed titles to anonymous shell corporations holding hundreds of millions in global assets. The combination to the safe is the exact time on the silver watch I left you. The watch has been broken since the day you were born, frozen at the exact minute you came into this world and changed my life for the better. You were the only one who stayed by me, Abigail. You are my only true heir. The world belongs to you now. Make them pay for underestimating you. Abigail stood in the cold, bright bunker, the diamond glittering on the desk, the silence of the forest above suddenly feeling less like a tomb and more like a fortress. She turned slowly, her eyes locking onto the massive steel dial of the Mosler safe. The watch in her pocket felt heavy. The combination was 1024. She wasn't a discarded daughter anymore. She was the wealthiest woman in the state, and her siblings had absolutely no idea what was coming for them. Abigail's hands were steady as she reached out to the massive cold steel dial of the Mosler safe. The bunker was entirely silent, save for the low rhythmic hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. She took a deep breath, the scent of ozone and old paper filling her lungs, and began to turn the dial. 10. Click. 24. Click. She grabbed the heavy chrome handle and pulled. The locking mechanism engaged with a deep, satisfying metallic clunk, and the thick door swung open smoothly, revealing the true gravity of Harrison Dempsey's secret life. Inside, stacked with meticulous precision, were rows of Credit Suisse gold bars, gleaming softly in the harsh light. Below them sat thick, rubber-banded stacks of bearer bonds, from banks in Zurich, Luxembourg, and the Cayman Islands. But the most important item was a simple leather binder, resting on the middle shelf. Abigail pulled it out and opened it on the metal desk. Inside were the incorporation documents for a holding company named Vanguard Meridian LLC, registered in Delaware. Attached were bank statements that made Abigail dizzy. Vanguard Meridian held liquid assets, aggressive growth portfolios, and anonymous real estate trusts across the globe. Her father had systematically siphoned the lifeblood out of Dempsey Logistics for 2 decades, funneling the capital into this untraceable entity. And as the sole named beneficiary in the private trust documents, Abigail now owned it all. She spent 3 days in that cabin, organizing, reading, and understanding the financial weapon her father had handed her. Then she locked the safe, concealed the trapdoor, and drove back to Boston. She didn't buy a mansion or a sports car. She hired Jonathan Hayes, a ruthless, high-end corporate attorney who specialized in aggressive acquisitions, and gave him one simple instruction: watch my siblings and wait. She didn't have to wait long. Exactly 6 months later, the illusion of the Dempsey empire began to shatter. It started with a minor investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission into Dempsey Logistics accounting practices. That thread, once pulled, unraveled a massive sweater of corporate fraud, over-leveraged assets, and hidden debt that Harrison had purposefully left ticking like a time bomb. Within weeks, the Department of Justice announced a massive antitrust lawsuit against the company. The stock of Dempsey Logistics plummeted by 70% in a single afternoon. For Felix Dempsey, the collapse was catastrophic. He had used his controlling shares in the logistics company as collateral to fund his risky Silicon Valley tech ventures. When the stock crashed, the banks issued brutal margin calls. His tech portfolio evaporated overnight. Caroline was faring no better. Her inherited liquid assets had been tied up in fidelity funds that were aggressively linked to Dempsey real estate properties that were suddenly tied up in federal liens. The renovations on her Tuscan villa were halted, and her accounts were frozen. The millions they had gloated over in William Thatcher's office were nothing but toxic paper. Desperation breeds audacity. On a rainy Tuesday morning, Abigail's burner phone buzzed. It was Felix. "Abigail." He said, his voice tight, attempting to project the old aristocratic arrogance, but failing miserably. "We need to talk. I'm calling a family meeting at William's office tomorrow at noon. Don't be late." "What is this about, Felix?" Abigail asked, her voice calm, devoid of the anxiety she used to feel around him. "It's about that piece of land Dad left you," Felix snapped. "Dempsey Logistics is restructuring. We've discovered that the Blackwood tract sits on a highly valuable timber reserve. The board needs to acquire it for immediate liquidation. I'm prepared to offer you $50,000 for the deed. Cash. You'd be a fool to pass it up." Abigail smiled, staring out the window of the modest apartment she was still renting. He was lying. There was no board restructuring. There was only a desperate man trying to squeeze pennies out of rocks to stave off bankruptcy. "I'll see you tomorrow at noon, Felix," Abigail replied, and hung up the phone. The atmosphere in the conference room at Abernathy Cole and Thatcher was entirely different than it had been 6 months prior. The room still smelled of expensive espresso, but the air of victory had been replaced by the suffocating stench of panic. Felix looked 10 years older. The tailored Italian suit hung loosely on his frame, his eyes bloodshot and surrounded by deep, dark circles. Caroline was unrecognizable. She wore a simple, unbranded black dress, her signature diamond-encrusted Rolex noticeably absent from her wrist, likely pawned to pay her immediate legal fees. William Thatcher sat at the head of the table looking incredibly uncomfortable. The heavy oak doors opened, and Abigail walked in. She was no longer wearing the cheap, off-the-rack coat. She wore a perfectly tailored navy blue wool suit, her hair styled sleekly. She carried a slim, expensive leather briefcase, her posture radiating absolute authority. Caroline blinked, momentarily taken aback by her half-sister's transformation. "Well, it seems you spent your little timber advance already. Let's get this over with," Felix interrupted, sliding a legal document across the table. "Here is the transfer deed for the Whispering Pines tract. Sign it, Abigail. William has a certified check for $50,000 ready for you. You sign, you take the money, and you walk away." Abigail didn't look at the document. She didn't even sit down. She simply placed her leather briefcase on the table, the brass clasps clicking sharply in the quiet room. "I'm afraid I won't be selling the property, Felix," Abigail said, her voice smooth as glass. "I've grown quite fond of the basement." Felix scowled, confusion washing over his exhausted face. "The basement? What are you talking about?" "There is no basement. It's a rotting shack." "Actually," William Thatcher interjected, clearing his throat nervously, "there is a subterranean structure on the property. As the executor of your late father's private estate, I was instructed to remain silent about it until today." Caroline sat up, her eyes narrowing. "Private estate? What does that mean?" "William." Abigail opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick dossier, sliding it across the table toward Felix. It wasn't a transfer deed. It was a corporate acquisition filing. Over the last 3 months, Dempsey Logistics has defaulted on over $200 million in corporate loans, Abigail stated, pacing slowly behind the heavy oak chairs. The banks began selling off that toxic debt to private equity firms for pennies on the dollar, just to clear their ledgers. Felix stared at the dossier, his face draining of color. How do you know about our debt structuring? Because, Abigail continued, a cold, hard edge entering her voice, a holding company named Vanguard Meridian LLC purchased 80% of that debt. And since Dempsey Logistics has failed to meet its restructuring deadlines, Vanguard Meridian is legally seizing all remaining company assets, liquidating the corporate real estate, and forcing the company into Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Caroline let out a panicked, breathless laugh. What does some private equity firm have to do with us? Or you? Abigail stopped pacing. She looked directly into Felix's eyes, watching the horrific realization dawn on his face before she even spoke the words. I'm the sole beneficiary and CEO of Vanguard Meridian LLC, Abigail said. Dad didn't leave you an empire, Felix. He left you a financial grenade with the pin pulled. He transferred all his real wealth, his gold, his bonds, his offshore accounts into Vanguard Meridian over the last 20 years. And he left it all to me, hidden beneath the floorboards of that rotting shack. Silence crashed down on the room, heavy and suffocating. No, Caroline whispered, her voice trembling. No, that's illegal. We can sue. We will tie you up in court for the next 30 years. With what money? Caroline, Abigail asked sharply. Your accounts are frozen. Your villa is in foreclosure. Felix's tech stocks are worthless. You don't have the capital to hire a paralegal, let alone a team of litigators to fight $1 billion holding company. Felix's hands shook as he flipped through the dossier, his eyes scanning the irrefutable proof of his own destruction. The signatures the bank seals the flawless legal maneuvering executed by Abigail's attorney. It was airtight. They were ruined. Why? Felix choked out, looking up at her, his aristocratic pride completely shattered. Why would he do this to us? Because for 3 years, while he was dying in agony, neither of you called. Abigail said, the righteous anger finally breaking through her calm facade. You didn't visit. You didn't care. You only cared about his checkbook. You treated him like a stepping stone, and you treated me like the hired help. Abigail reached into her briefcase one last time and pulled out an envelope. She tossed it onto the center of the table. Inside that envelope is a cashier's check for exactly $42,000, Abigail said. That is the exact amount of medical debt I accrued paying for Dad's private nurses when his insurance ran out. It's yours. A severance package. It should be enough to cover your immediate legal fees and perhaps a few months' rent in a modest apartment. She snapped her briefcase shut. You're taking everything, Caroline sobbed, burying her face in her hands. No, Abigail corrected her, turning toward the oak doors. I'm taking back what was stolen from me. Enjoy the legacy you earned. Abigail Mercer walked out of Abernathy Cole and Thatcher for the last time. She stepped out onto the bustling Boston streets, taking a deep breath of the crisp autumn air. She had no intention of keeping the toxic logistics company. She would liquidate it, donate the proceeds to healthcare charities, and return to the Blackwood Mountains. She had a cabin to rebuild, a fortune to manage, and for the first time in her life, absolute freedom. What a stunning turn of events! Abigail transformed from a discarded daughter into a brilliant mastermind, proving that kindness and loyalty ultimately pay off, while greed only leads to ruin. If this incredible story of ultimate revenge and hidden wealth kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more jaw-dropping real-life dramas. Leave a comment below. What would you do with the bunker?